filling in for our supervisor. He couldn't come because of a health condition. And we have two speakers, and they're going to each speak in about 20 minutes. And then 10 minutes behind. Okay, starting with Britten. Thomas A. Britten from the University of Texas at Rio Grande Valley, talking about assimilation. I'm going to ring that bell. About assimilation or reorganization, federal Indian policies of TR and FDR. And Mr. Britten, Dr. Britten, will be talking about Lincoln tomorrow too. Slightly negative, I think, but we're open-minded to everything. Okay, Dr. Britten, with a PowerPoint presentation.
Gotta do both.
That one helps a little bit.
Gotta do both.
Oh, both.
I said
there we go.
There you go.
Okay, if it's okay with you, as soon as you're done talking, we'll start with him, and then we'll handle the questions afterwards.
Awesome.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to especially welcome the 30 high school students we have in the back. Right now, I've got back in Brownsville, Texas, I've got about 52 early college high school students of my own that I teach in U.S. History 1, and they were devastated that I had to cancel class today because I was coming.
They're in mourning.
So, anyway, welcome. My research interest is in Native American history, and in particular, federal Indian policy. In other words, how the government has interacted over the years with different Native peoples. And what has attracted me is just the absurdity of the whole relationship, going really all the way back, I think, to George Washington. So when I got Dr. Peterson's invitation for a Roosevelt Century Conference, I thought, well, here's the good opportunity to compare and contrast the Indian policies of these two guys. So anyway, here goes. Throughout the 20th century, Native Americans have bore the unpleasant distinction of being one of the smallest minority groups in the United States, constituting about 1% of the population. And as such, they rarely commanded the attention of the federal government. Historian Philip Deloria painted a decidedly bleak picture of this government indifference in his assessment that, quote, all the presidents since U.S. Grant have given collectively about 8 hours of thought to Indian affairs. And I did the math, and that's about 20 minutes per president from Grant through about Richard Nixon. But to be fair, most presidents entered office knowing little, if anything, about federal Indian policy, possessed only a vague understanding about the complex problems facing Native peoples, and could count the number of Indian acquaintances they had on one hand. Such generalizations, as we'll see, do not necessarily apply to the two Roosevelts, at least not equally. While both men were products of the progressive reform movement, one of the Roosevelts entered office with expansive knowledge about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had visited several reservations, and worked closely with Indian reform organizations, and had very definite opinions about how to address the so-called Indian question. The other Roosevelt had practically no experience in Indian affairs, had left little written evidence that he had ever given them much thought, and came into office with virtually no opinion about how to address the multitude of problems facing America's indigenous peoples. So my goal today is to offer a broad comparison of the two Roosevelt Indian policies as a means of better understanding the governing philosophy and worldview of each man. In my view, an administration's Indian policy can offer a window through which we can view a particular administration's priorities, its understandings about the proper role and responsibilities of government, and its view of humanity. And so, with that in mind, we'll say a little bit about the two Roosevelts. In June of 1971, 6 American Indian protesters vandalized the statue of Theodore Roosevelt, pictured here, which stands in front of the New York City's American Museum of Natural History. Sculpted by James Earl Frazier in 1939, the statue now carried the epithet fascist killer in bold red paint. To many anthropologists, historians, as well as Indians themselves, TR stands with Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison in the pantheon of presidential Indian haters. An examination of Roosevelt's life and career showed that he was a complex individual. And indeed, he did provide critics with ample ammunition to characterize him as a white supremacist and racist. In an infamous January 1888 speech, which I've got captioned here, the future president was quoted as saying, "I don't go as far to think as the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe that 9 out of every 10 are. And I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. And then the most vicious cowboy has more principle than the average Indian." TR apologists would dismiss such rhetoric as typical Roosevelt hyperbole, and instead focus their attention on the man's tenure on the Civil Service Commission and his close association with prominent Indian reform organizations such as the Indian Rights Association, or the IRA. During his time on the commission, which was about 6 years, and that's pictured here on your left, Roosevelt sought to replace government patronage in the selection of BIA personnel with a merit system, and he deserves credit for, at least some credit, for President Benjamin Harrison's decision to put 700 BIA jobs under the civil service. In 1892, Roosevelt accompanied IRA head Herbert Welch, pictured there on your right, on an inspection of Sioux reservations in South Dakota, as well as Omaha and Winnebago reservations in Nebraska, the most concentrated education in the Indian service he would have prior to his presidency. When President McKinley was elected president 4 years later, IRA leaders proposed that Roosevelt become the new Commissioner of Indian Affairs. But he had other ambitions, namely to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And while serving in that capacity until the outbreak of the Spanish-American War and later as governor of New York, Roosevelt's interest in Indian affairs continued, adopting the prevailing assimilationist-oriented policy that he would carry forward into his presidency. Teddy Roosevelt called for the Americanization of Native peoples via education, missionary work, the allotment of reservation lands to individual Indians, and U.S. citizenship. It's difficult to determine exactly how his racial views influenced his Indian policies, and it's important to note that those racial views evolved over time. He ascribed racial shortcomings more to geographic environment than to genetic inferiority. He acknowledged differences between various tribes and was confident that any people had the capacity to improve. Writing in 1888, he noted that an upper-class Cherokee is nowadays as good as a white. The Nez Perce differ from the Apaches as much as a Scotch laird from a Calabrian bandit. Scotch laird, I think, is a large Scotch landholder. Calabrian bandit, I believe, would be a bandit from the Tow region of Italy. A Cheyenne warrior is one of the most redoubtable foes in the whole world. A Digger Snake Indian, one of the most despicable. The Pueblo is as thrifty, industrious, and peaceful as any European peasant, and no Arab of the Sudan is a lazier, wilder robber than is the Arapaho. Roosevelt likewise stressed the differences between individuals, himself a man of boundless energy, as has been noted in some of our earlier papers, with an insatiable appetite for the strenuous life and work. He scorned individuals of all races who were lazy, inefficient, weak, and who lacked proper initiative. He denounced, for example, the extravagant lifestyle of his brother Elliot and his daughter Alice, while praising the character of a Mingo Indian chief named Logan, who he called a skilled marksman and a mighty hunter of commanding dignity, who treated all men with great courtesy. He was greatly liked and respected by all the white hunters and frontiersmen, whose friendship and respect were worth having. Like many Native American-focused reformers of the time, Roosevelt most certainly would have claimed the title friend of the Indian, and he accepted the validity of the two choices that reformers at that time believed were held out to Indians, either assimilation or extermination. As president, he appointed longtime friend and IRA member Francis Ellington Loop as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Like Roosevelt, Loop endorsed assimilation via education, the allotment of Indian lands, and citizenship as solutions to the Indian question. Both men also shared the progressive belief in efficient government and that an application of the merit system to the Indian service would do much to dispel graft and alleviate problems on reservations. In theory, at least, both Roosevelt and Loop supported employing qualified Indians to serve in government positions on reservations, an idea that would reach fruition a generation later. Roosevelt had little patience for Indian land claims, since in his opinion, Native Americans made poor use of their reservations, and only those who made efficient use of their land were entitled to keep it. He was also initially, at least, opposed to Indians leasing their lands, since the practice retarded their agricultural pursuits and discouraged assimilation. Later in his presidency, he's going to relax those ideas and become a little bit more flexible. Roosevelt and Loop were likewise convinced that education held the key to Indian assimilation. Recognizing that cultural transformation was unlikely among elderly or middle-aged Indians, they put their focus on Indian children and developed a more humane and practical system for Indian children. Loop, like Roosevelt, was interested in preserving elements of Indian culture. This is Commissioner Loop. Especially art and music. The last thing that ought to be done with Indian youth, whom we are trying to indoctrinate with self-respect, Loop argued, is to teach them to be ashamed of their ancestry. The preservation of traditional arts and crafts, furthermore, held the potential to provide Indians with a viable income and a means to achieve self-sufficiency, which were both steps in their ultimate assimilation. So Roosevelt's Indian policy, like the man himself, is kind of a bundle of contradictions. The assimilation policy and reduction in Indian land holdings brought about by the Dawes Act, which he supported, as we now know, were catastrophic to Indian peoples and clear violations of the government's trust responsibilities to the tribes. On the other hand, Roosevelt's crusade for civil service reform, to alleviate graft and corruption in the Indian service, and to reform Indian education, and emphasize preserving aspects of culture and tradition, laid the groundwork for the Indian New Deal. So for a man often portrayed as a racist, a fascist, an anti-Indian, Roosevelt compiled a formidable record of interventions on behalf of American Indians, both before and during his presidency. Well, unlike his distant cousin Theodore, FDR had virtually no experience in Indian affairs prior to taking office. As a boy, he accompanied his family on summer retreats to Campobello Island on Passamaquoddy Bay off the coast of New Brunswick in Canada. There, Roosevelt met and, according to I think, myth or legend, befriended a Passamaquoddy Indian named Toma Joseph, who was about 45 years older than Roosevelt. Joseph may have served as a ferryman for the Roosevelt family to get the family's belongings up to the island whenever they went out there, and maybe as a guide of sorts. At some point prior to his death in 1914, Toma Joseph constructed a birch bark canoe for Roosevelt. And here he is, not quite sailing, but paddling across Passamaquoddy Bay. The official website for Campobello International Park maintains that FDR's policies toward Native Americans, quote, were a reflection of his association with the Passamaquoddy Indians he came to know and respect at Campobello. That may be partly the case, but there is scant evidence that Roosevelt possessed much interest in Indians, nor policy prescriptions to address the rampant problems in Indian country prior to becoming president. Like FDR's racial views lacked an appreciation, like FDR's racial views were more or less consistent with the time in which he lived. Historian Kenneth O'Reilly writes that FDR, quote, lacked an appreciation of or sympathy for problems of race and racism in American life. The NAACP's Roy Wilkins described Roosevelt this way, quote, he was a New York patrician, distant, aloof, with no natural feel for the sensibilities of black people, no compelling inner commitment to their cause. He banned black reporters from his news conferences throughout his presidency and failed to support anti-lynching legislation for fear of Southern backlash against the New Deal. Whether or not this racial detachment likewise pertained to Native Americans is unclear. The dearth of evidence in this regard may suggest that, like most presidents, FDR simply never gave much thought to American Indians at all. That said, the consensus of scholars interested in Native American history is that the Indian New Deal marked a watershed moment in the relationship between Native Americans and the national government. Largely the product of Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Collier, the longest-serving commissioner in American history, the Indian New Deal reflected the community building or collectivist nature of the Roosevelt administration. To this end, Collier called for an end to the allotment of Indian lands so that tribes could rebuild their land base, the reorganization and empowerment of tribal governments, limitations on federal Indian interference in tribal affairs, and the preservation of Indian cultures. Collier had been a long advocate of Indian policy reform, and he was a vocal critic of the BIA during the 1920s. He had apparently never met FDR prior to 1933, and after FDR's victory over Herbert Hoover, Collier lobbied for progressive Republican Harold Ickes, pictured there on your right, to become the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Ickes had been a bull mooser who campaigned for Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. When FDR instead asked Ickes to become Interior Secretary, Ickes turned to Collier to head the BIA. According to Collier's memoir entitled From Every Zenith, his personal contacts with President Roosevelt were few, and he communicated his ideas to the Oval Office via Secretary Ickes. After the U.S. entry into World War II, Collier recalled, I was careful never to take up his time in anything. With his help, when his help was asked for in Indian matters, he gave it always, but I understood, as Ickes did, that the burden of Indian struggles must rest on ourselves and must not be added to the burden on Roosevelt. Like TR, FDR held a dim view about Indian land claims. In 1936, he vetted a land claims bill relevant to California Indians for territories lost back in the 1850s. While Theodore Roosevelt opposed land claims based on the perception that Native Americans failed to make good use of land, FDR argued that the cultures, the societies, the souls of these Indians, and not only their biological stock have been destroyed. It makes little sense, therefore, to pay money damages in behalf of the dead to the few who yet lived. And the government's obligation toward the living and the living and Indians yet unborn were more important. And he promised greater expanding than for Indian programs during the New Deal, a promise that he was unable to keep once we enter World War II. So, the two Roosevelt Indian policies do share some similarities. Both endorsed education as a highly significant step, FDR noted, in attaining a wholesome American life. Both administrations expanded funding for schools. Both opposed sending Indian children to off-reservation boarding schools. Both promoted the teaching of Indian cultures and histories. For Loop, it was a means of fostering self-respect. For Collier, it was due to their inherent value, both to Native Americans and to the nation as a whole. Both administrations sought to expand the number of Indians serving in the PIA. The critical difference between the two centers on the issue of land, specifically the desirability of maintaining or expanding the Indians' land base. For Teddy Roosevelt and many self-described friends of the Indians of the late 19th and early 20th century, communal ownership of land stood as an obstacle to Native American cultural evolution and assimilation. If the reservations were broken up and their inhabitants individualized, Indians would remain trapped in their ongoing state of barbarism. Consequently, TR endorsed the Dawes Act, which promised to liberate Native Americans from a future of dependency and likely extinction. FDR, meanwhile, argued that the continued application of allotment had resulted in Indian land losses of more than 2/3 of Indian reservation lands, while the costs of maintaining those lands had steadily mounted. As a matter of justice that was long overdue, he called for an end to the allotment process. Finally, the Indian policies of the two Roosevelts provide insights into the governing philosophies of the two men. Possessing, as biographer John Milton Cooper noted, the characteristics of both warrior and priest, TR sought to destroy communal land holdings and reduce Indian dependency, while encouraging education and the preservation of native arts and crafts as a means of upward mobility and self-sufficiency. John Collier, meanwhile, viewed FDR's leadership style in this way. According to Collier, FDR was, in his most individual and most universal interest in self, an artist at the core, whose medium was the lives of men and the life of man. The inspiration for this art Collier encountered was little known even to himself. So when assessing the Indian policies of the two Roosevelts, one must bear in mind the historical context surrounding their presidencies to recognize that both men believed that their policies were in the best interests of both Indians and the nation as a whole, and that the so-called Indian question persisted despite policy prescriptions promoted by both administrations. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that policymakers embraced self-determination as the antidote, a policy prescription foreshadowed to some extent by both Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Britten. That was really helpful to have those photos. Our next speaker is, before I introduce him, let me, for you high-tech people, the whole conference is going to be on YouTube. 5 of the opening session is already on YouTube, plus 4 other sessions. And I've got to thank Shahab Gobadi there, who's my high-tech youngest person on the whole conference who will be presenting a paper tomorrow, but he does all the high-tech stuff. I don't know. I'll just leave it at that. So if you want to see it, YouTube, Lincoln Center job.
That's it, yes.
Okay, you'll see the whole thing. I've never gone to YouTube in my life. I don't know what that is. Okay, so our Shahab from Kurdistan, and our next speaker is from Italy. Thank you, Italy. And he's a repeat player. I told you about repeat players if you were here yesterday, so I don't pay much attention to him because he knows what this is all about. And he's going to be presenting a paper on
FDR and TR and racial issues.
Thank you.
Good morning, thank you for being here. I apologize for reading my presentation, but as a practitioner of English as a foreign language, after a 17-hour flight from Italy yesterday, I feel on safer ground with a written text. So, after Booker T. Washington had dinner with TR at the White House in 1901, Democratic Senator Bill Tillman of South Carolina reportedly remarked that white supremacists would have to kill, quote, 1,000 niggers in the South before they learn the place again, unquote. Conversely, a third of a century later, the 1934 meeting of Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, with President FDR on the south portico of the presidential mansion, stirred much less controversy among segregationists. These two meetings are representative of both presidents' attitude to our race issues and their implications. So my paper assesses how TR and FDR addressed such matters. TR was of Southern lineage on his maternal side. Before inviting Washington to the White House, he had not shown much respect for African Americans. For instance, in the account of his own experience with the Spanish-American War, he had portrayed black soldiers as cowards who were generally unfit for the battlefield and usually shunned the front line. Furthermore, although TR's fascination with social Darwinism did not turn him into a white supremacist, it did not make him a champion of racial equality either. One might reasonably suggest that TR had mixed feelings in the field. For instance, in an 1885 speech, he harshly criticized the disenfranchisement of blacks in the South by force and fraud. Yet TR's words can be aptly interpreted less as a commitment to African American rights than as both a defense of colorblind lawfulness per se and a stigmatization of illegal means that hindered the electoral chances of the Republican Party in the South. Indeed, it's politics that offers the most suitable background to evaluate TR's attitude toward racial issues. Washington's invitation can be reasonably regarded as a political statement. TR, as we know, was an accidental president. The GOP had selected him for vice president in 1900 in order to remove the New York State governor from the political spotlight and to relegate his flamboyant personality to a powerless office. If TR wanted to run for the White House in 1904 in his own right, he had to secure the control of the Republican machinery and to snatch the helm of the party from the hands of William McKinley's kingmaker, Senator Hanna, and the latter's entourage. These politicians had been instrumental in distancing the GOP from African Americans' claims for equal rights in southern states after the 1896 presidential election. On that occasion, McKinley won the first term with the support of the northeastern working class, although it didn't carry any southern state. The election outcome therefore demonstrated that Republican candidates were able to secure the presidency without the backing of the South. This awareness caused the Republican officials to further disregard the pursuit of black voters, their main potential electoral preserve below the Mason-Dixon line, and to discourage previous attempts such as Henry Cabot Lodge's 1890 federal election bill at interfering with the disenfranchisement of Southern African Americans. This strategy of retreat from the advocacy of blacks' integration had already surfaced following the end of the Reconstruction and the progressive expulsion of African American voters from the participating electorate, but it gained momentum only at the turn of the new century. It is likely that TR too shared the view that, as a Republican candidate, he could obtain a full term in 1904 without carrying the South. He also failed to quote African American voters in the North on the grounds that they were unable to make a difference in the region. Yet, TR did need the support of Southern delegates to receive their presidential nomination. As Anna's stalwarts were usually lily white, he had to quote the black and tan faction of the GOP. This backdrop helps account for TR's opening to African Americans as epitomized by his invitation of Washington to the White House. After all, the president subsequently made additional gesture of recognition towards the black community. For instance, in 1902, he nominated an African American physician, William Cramp, to the position of collector of the port of Charleston, and kept him in office by means of several recess appointments after the Senate had refused his confirmation. In the same year, in his Memorial Day address, though without referring explicitly to blacks as victims of mob violence, TR condemned the lynching as, quote, inhuman cruelty and barbarity and a lasting shame of our people, unquote. Conversely, TR turned his back at African Americans after winning the 1904 election. In 1906, for instance, in his capacity of Commander-in-Chief, the President discharged without honor all the 176 black soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the 25th Infantry Regiment after a handful of them had caused a riot resulting in the killing of a white bartender and a white police officer in Brownsville, Texas. Significant enough for the influence of politicking on TR's race-related decisions, the President's order was not disclosed to the public until the 1906 midterm elections were held. The same year, in a letter to author Owen Wister, TR endorsed the restriction of African American suffrage to, quote, the occasionally good, well-educated, intelligent, and honest colored men and women, unquote. In addition, in a partial reversal of his 1902 Memorial Day stand, TR argued in the 1906 State of the Union address that, quote, the greatest existing cause of lynching is the perpetration, especially by black men, of the hideous crime of rape, unquote. Of course, the President did not justify popular justice, yet the average number of lynched African Americans per year had risen to 80 during his administration. TR bought at face value the white supremacist argument, namely, the Southerners had to take the law into their hands to protect women from black assaults. He also lent the presidential clout and authoritativeness to confute the conclusion of numerous African American activists such as Ida B. Wells, who had demonstrated that most lynchings were unrelated to rapes and were essentially the killings of innocent people for the purpose of intimidating blacks and suffocating the struggle for equal rights and economic rights. After securing a second term, TR revived the Republican dream of breaking the Democratic monopoly in the South and endeavored to build a following for the GOP in this region. In the face of black disenfranchisement, this strategy meant aligning with white voters on racial issues. Enticing such a cohort of the electorate turned from an option into a necessity when TR cast his hat in the presidential ring again and made his bid for the White House in 1912. Indeed, that year, the Progressive Party ran a lily white campaign in the South. If TR eventually aimed at the prize that he failed to achieve, FDR endeavored to keep the Southern white vote in the Democratic column. Smith's Catholicism had contributed to let Herbert Hoover carry the Upper South in 1928. Challenging segregation would have been likely to result in even more ominous consequences for FDR's presidential hopes. One cannot conclude that FDR did woo white voters on race issues, but he did nothing that could alienate their support. He chose a Texan segregationist, Speaker John Gardner, as his running mate and ignored the NAACP call for plans on civil rights in the elaboration of the Democratic platform. Furthermore, the New Deal failed to address both the Jim Crow legislation and the economic conditions of African Americans as a minority group, although the Depression had hit African Americans more severely than whites. For instance, at the climax of the crisis in the winter of 1933, the unemployment rate was 37% for blacks as opposed to 21% for whites. Due to the seniority rule, Southern senators and representatives held key positions on congressional committees. FDR therefore needed their support to have his economic agenda passed into law. Therefore, the New Deal did not interfere with Jim Crow practices. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps established segregated camps for African Americans. The Tennessee Valley Authority allowed the discrimination of blacks in hiring and housing. The National Recovery Administration tolerated unequal pay scales on racial basis, and agencies such as the Civil Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration tended to confine African American employees to menial jobs. Other programs penalized blacks, for instance, by granting federal subsidies to landowners who reduced the acreage of cultivated fields. The Agricultural Adjustment Act caused the dismissal of more than 100,000 black sharecroppers. Likewise, the Social Security Act excluded from its benefits domestic workers, temporary laborers, and hired farm hands, three categories in which African Americans bulked large. FDR also failed to endorse the 1935 Costigan-Wagner bill that aimed at both turning lynching into a federal crime and punishing enforcement officials who refused to prevent acts of summary justice, thereby introducing deterrence to mob violence against African Americans. Yet lynchings continued to be an emergency in the South during the FDR administration. For instance, as many as 28, namely more than 2 per month, were committed in 1933, the year the new president took office. Attorney General Homer Cummings even argued that the so-called Lindbergh Act, stipulating that it was a capital offense for kidnappers to cross state lines with their victims, could not apply to the 1934 interstate abduction, lynching, and mutilation of Claude Neal. In Cummings' opinion, this crime did not involve a ransom request, as the federal law allegedly implied. FDR confined himself to symbolic gesture toward African Americans. He appointed Robert Vann, a black lawyer and the editor-publisher of the Pittsburgh Courier, as Assistant Attorney General. The nomination was a reward for Vann's endorsement of FDR in the 1932 presidential race. Yet Vann was a powerless figure whose role was confined to demonstrating African Americans' political recognition on the part of FDR. Specifically, he was prevented from dealing with civil rights issues, and after being snubbed at the Justice Department to such an extent that white secretaries refused to take dictation because he was black, Vann resigned as soon as 1935. In 1936, FDR also set up a Federal Council on Negro Affairs, or the Black Cabinet, as it was called, namely a group of African American advisors whom he consulted about issues concerning the black community. Still, although it was instrumental in encouraging the appointment of an increasing number of blacks to administrative positions, the Black Cabinet had no form of power and was unable to secure civil rights legislation. Prominent in the Federal Council on Negro Affairs was Mary McLeod Bethune, a mid-ranking office holder in the National Youth Administration and a confidant of FDR's wife. Indeed, Eleanor Roosevelt, an outspoken liberal on racial issues, was at the forefront in the president's opening to African Americans. FDR let the First Lady take stance that the chief executive officer himself could not afford if he did not want to arise Southern whites' political backlash. The plan was that African Americans would associate Eleanor's position with her husband's, while the president would minimize the electoral aftershocks of the First Lady's behavior in the eyes of white supremacists on the grounds that she was not a member of the administration and therefore her implicit advocacy of racial equality could not be ascribed to the White House. In any case, Eleanor's gestures as her husband's informal spokesperson on race issues were mainly cosmetic and were further curbed by political compromise. For example, when the Daughters of the American Revolution denied back contralto Marian Anderson the opportunity to give a concert at Washington's Constitution Hall in 1939, the First Lady resigned from this association and arranged for the African American singer to perform at the Lincoln Memorial. Likewise, after disputing segregated seating at Birmingham's 1938 Southern Conference on Human Welfare and trying to sit in the black sector of the audience, Eleanor Roosevelt eventually agreed to move her chair to the aisle between the two sections. FDR's one decision benefiting African American as blacks 1941 Executive Order 8802 that banned racial discrimination in the employment and promotion of workers for the defense contractors of the federal government. The requirement, however, was less a civil rights provision than a war measure. Indeed, FDR issued the executive order in response to A. Philip Randolph's threat of a march on Washington to protest against prejudice in defense industries. While the US had not entered World War II yet, but supported indirectly the United Kingdom against Nazi Germany by emphasizing the mistreatment of African Americans, Randolph's march would have stricken a relevant blow to FDR's assertion that the US was a champion of democracy against the totalitarian regimes. Executive Order 8802 resulted in the cancellation of the protest and diffused a potential ideological danger. In addition, FDR rejected Philip's call for the integration of US armed forces, and the Fair Employment Practice Committee, which was established to implement the executive order, had very limited powers because it could expose cases of discrimination, but it was not granted the powers to punish unfairness in hiring. Nonetheless, a majority of African Americans switched the partisan allegiance during the New Deal. Roughly 2/3 of the blacks who were able to vote because they resided in the North cast their ballots for Hoover in 1932. The same ratio supported FDR in 1936. The strategy of FDR's cosmetic gestures of recognition usually played second fiddle to real economic benefits in shaping blacks' voting behavior. As the Depression hit hardest the community, the New Deal helped a disproportionate number of African Americans, not because they were black, but because they were poor and unemployed. In spite of lingering discrimination, in 1935, more than 1 million African Americans held a job with the Works Progress Administration, and about 1/3 of black families profited by some kind of federal relief, as opposed to 10% of white households. In conclusion, TR confined himself primarily to symbolism on racial issues, and even discontinued this policy after 1904. FDR too initially adopted a strategy of mainly token gestures, but later supplemented it with a specific measure such as Executive Order 8802. In addition, the colorblind provisions of the New Deal did, in any case, bring about significant changes to the economic conditions of African Americans, although they did not intend to ensure racial equality and consequently did not achieve it. Thank you for your patience.
So we have about 5 minutes. We're running behind time. So maybe 2 short questions to each speaker, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to have the annual list lecture. So I just put squelch on all of your questions, but go ahead.
Yes, I read to Dr. Britten's paper, very well balanced. I thoroughly enjoyed it. One quibble I would have, instead of saying from Grant on, I would say from Hayes on, because Grant did have a significant record. It wouldn't pass church-state muster today, but to clean up corruption in the Indian Service, he employed it with Quakers, who would be selfless, allegedly, and so forth, and it did help. Also, he appointed Eli S. Parker, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the first time an Indian was ever appointed to anything, especially to Indian Affairs. Even though there was some question at the time regarding constitutionality and citizenship of Parker, he pushed it through regarding this.
No, that's a point well taken. That was a direct quote taken from Philip Delory. So our collective quibble is with him.
Right.
But I would agree about Grant. Grant was certainly knowledgeable about Native American issues because he had to confront many directly head on while president. So I would agree that he should be included in that group. Yes, sir.
If it's all right, I have a two-part question, and it's not historical, it's political. I want to say I enjoyed both papers very much. But I wanted to ask, first of all, Dr. Britten, do you think that the Native American gambling casinos are a significant aid to Native Americans? And secondly, do you think that possibly in the future a similar type of concession for marijuana or some other mild drug might also improve Native American economic status, if you answer the first question positively?
Well, I mean, that is, I mean, there's studies that would definitely show that in terms of the amount of money brought in to tribes and the amount of money then that is invested in other types of enterprises, you know, gas stations, motels, and so on, that the casino initiative that takes place, you know, beginning under Reagan and then forward, has done a lot of good for Indian communities. There's more recent studies that show, however, that you know, not so much fears about organized crime, but that tribes that have the casinos and then do per capita distributions, instead of taking the money and then investing it in tribal businesses, they instead distribute it with per capita payments. That has had lots of unintended and pretty negative consequences. So it kind of depends on the tribe and how it invests the proceeds from the casino industry. I think those that are really looking, you know, a long ways down the road and trying to build up different types of industries for when the casinos maybe lose their luster, they're the ones that I think are, you know, the one. I think most would argue that it's been good, certainly good for them. But for others that are, you know, they're just becoming dependent upon the per capita distribution, and they're not really investing it. They're more, I think, you know, squandering it. In terms of the marijuana concession, do I think that would be a good idea? And was that your?
Well, do you think it would be helpful to Native Americans?
Well, I mean, I don't know what the demand is. I mean, I don't know if there is a huge national demand for marijuana, and if that is legalized, that it's going to provide the type of income or the level of income that's going to have a really meaningful big bang effect on tribal communities. I mean, there's reservations that are absolutely destitute, and I just don't know that legalizing marijuana is going to be their salvation. It might be helpful to some tribes, but I'm skeptical that is a solution to their problems.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yes, yes, Luconi. As the black community in the United States calls slavery, and I would also, and the discrimination against blacks, I'd say the same thing about the discrimination against Indians. It is America's original sin. And hearing it from a foreigner, it becomes even more pronounced. But we have to cut some slack to these guys. For example, Roosevelt, if he hadn't done something, he would not get the South on his side for World War II. I mean, he passed the draft by one vote, I believe. just before Pearl Harbor. You know, and given the past, I mean, he rejected the St. Louis, which was loaded with Jewish refugees who'd been thrown out of, who were allowed to leave Germany, and went all over the world, went back to Germany, and all those people were slaughtered during World War II. You got to give him slack on some of those things. These are complicated issues, and it was very difficult, but it's still, it leaves, and Abraham Lincoln was the one who said we have to do something about the slavery issue. We look terrible in the world. We can't lift up our head in world politics as a great savior country if this goes on. So I agree with you.
No, and I agree with you that politics was at the core of FDR's attitude to our racial issues. FDR was a master of political and electoral manipulation, and of course he needed the votes of the South not only to stay in the White House, but also to have his different kinds of legislation passed. First the New Deal, and then the revision of the Neutrality Acts in order to let the U.S. first to aid Great Britain, and after that enter World War II. And he couldn't do that by challenging segregation, and in part politics explains the subsequent development of the racial problems of the U.S. The more attention paid by post-World War II presidents to segregation, discrimination, and so on, in part resulted from the great migration of African Americans from the south to the north, where they were allowed to vote because there was no state legislation dodging the 15th Amendment, and so they had to be taken into account primarily for electoral reasons, and also for propaganda within the context of the Cold War. I mean, the dynamics of the international system, for example, the impact of decolonization did play a role in the support by Lyndon B. Johnson of civil rights and voting rights legislation. So I agree with you that the matter was very complicated.
And it puts even a bigger obligation on us to solve the problem, because it gets more pronounced the longer we live, and we look back at all of these things, that there's more we have to do.
I'm taking this pause that you want to take a 5-minute break. And you can discuss, you can talk with them during the break. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll resume with the annual Abraham Lincoln lecture.
Finish where? Here.